If you agree to marry me, I swear I won't let him take a single drop of water from this land, he said, his voice low as wind moving through a canyon, his hand brushing lightly against hers. James wasn't looking at the blood-red sky folding shut in the west. He was looking into Clara's eyes, where the sunset had pooled into a deep, honeyed gold. He didn't promise bountiful harvests or roaring celebrations. He only promised that Victor Kane would never take a single drop of water from this land, because it was her father's land, and it was where her heart belonged. Clara stood still, her skirts caught in the wind, hearing as if all sound had fallen away, leaving only the heartbeat of two people in the vast desert. In that moment, she understood that this vow wasn't just about keeping the lifeblood of the ranch. It was about keeping her whole, without condition. And in the parched heart of Wyoming, a promise like that was worth more than gold. Stay, and you'll see why a single promise can change the course of a life. Late summer in Wyoming is unlike any other season. The earth has long since drunk the last rains of spring. The grass burned into pale yellow strips, and the wind carries red dust from far off, laying it thin across the bare hills like an old, worn shawl. The sunlight now has lost its fierce glare, yet it holds a slow, lingering weight that clings to the skin, a reminder that winter will come sooner than one might think. Clara Wynne stood on the front porch, fingers wrapped tight around a cup of cold coffee. Her small wooden house seemed even smaller against the sweep of the plains around it, and against the crushing debt her father had left behind when he died. This land, with its sagging fences and thin cattle, was all Clara had, and it was exactly what Victor Kane wanted. Kane, the land baron who owned nearly half the valley, had sent his men 3 times in the past month, each visit a reminder that her banknote had come due. Every time their voices were smooth as velvet, but underneath was the cold edge of a blade. Sell to Kane for the price he named, or wait for the territorial court to seize it. Clara knew all too well, if Kane got it, the Northern Creek's water would be shut off, and those who refused to sell would wither away. Dust rose again at the far end of the trail. From a distance, a lone rider approached, his pace unhurried yet steady, as if he knew exactly where he was going and had no need to rush. His black horse, broad in the chest, with a heavy mane draped down its neck, breathed out clouds tinged with the scent of dust. Clara's grip on the cup tightened before she set it down on the railing. A stranger riding in at a time like this was never good news. She straightened, her hand brushing the Winchester propped beside the door. As the gap closed, she saw him more clearly. A man in his mid-30s, wearing a dark wool coat, broad-shouldered, and with a gaze that did not flinch. He stopped his horse a few paces from the fence, pulled off his gloves, and drew from his saddle a worn envelope. "James Calder, ma'am," he said, his voice low and unhurried. "I have a letter from Elias Wynne." At her father's name, Clara froze. He'd been gone nearly a year, and in that time no one had come with anything of his except unpaid bills. She stepped down from the porch, eyes fixed on the stranger. The letter's paper was yellowed, the handwriting unmistakably her father's. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not there to speak to you. James is a man you can trust. Let him help you." That was all. No explanation, no reason why. Clara looked up, suspicion battling the need to listen. "How did you know my father?" "We worked together for a time in Montana," James replied, keeping it short. "He pulled me out of a bad scrape. Told me if he ever needed it, I'd pay him back." The wind swirled red dust between them, carrying the scent of dry earth and burnt grass. Clara didn't believe in promises, delivered after the promiser was dead. But before she could press further, 3 riders appeared from the opposite direction, Kane's men. They rode straight into the yard without dismounting. The leader, his teeth crooked and yellow, called out that today was a lucky day for her to give her final answer. His voice carried enough mockery to make Clara's blood rise. She had just stepped forward to meet them when another man urged his horse into her fence, splintering the weathered boards. The crack of wood was like a knife in her chest. She started toward him, but James was faster. Without a word, he swung down from his horse, strode over, and seized the man's reins, wrenching hard. The rider tumbled to the ground, scrambling for his gun, but James's boot came down hard on his wrist. His eyes were cold enough to make the other 2 rein back. "I believe she said she wasn't ready to answer," James said evenly, with no softness at all. "You can come back with a court order, if you've got the guts." In that moment, Clara felt both startled and angry. She wasn't used to anyone stepping in for her, yet she couldn't deny he'd spared her an ugly fight. The 3 men, muttering curses, turned and rode off, their shapes swallowed by the red haze. Her heart was still pounding as she stepped back toward the house. James stood in the yard, dusting off his coat before leading his horse to the barn. He didn't ask permission, only said, "I'll be staying a few days, if you don't mind. I can mend fences and tend stock." Clara meant to refuse, but she remembered Kane's eyes each time his men came, and the letter from her father. "The stable's at the end of the row," she said. "Don't expect breakfast from me." James gave a slight nod, no smile, and led his horse away, his figure folding into the red of the sunset. Clara stayed on the porch, feeling as though a new wind, strange but not wholly threatening, had just passed through her life. By the next morning, Wyoming had draped itself in the withered gold that only appears when summer is running out of breath. The sun blazed bright, but without its old ferocity, replaced instead by a parched sting that cracked lips and burned the throat. Along the horizon, a thin ribbon of red dust had begun to coil upward, a sure sign the hard wind was on its way. James Calder was out of the barn before Clara had fully woken. He worked with the quiet certainty of a man who didn't wait to be told, someone accustomed to tending to things that, at least on paper, didn't belong to him. Carrying a hammer, a few boards, and coils of wire, he headed toward the east fence where winter storms had warped the rails and pulled nails loose. Clara had meant to leave him to it. She still didn't know what James wanted here and had no wish to owe a stranger anything. But from the porch, she saw the way he tested each post, drove each nail, like a man closing up an old wound, patient and deliberate. She couldn't deny the ranch hadn't been tended with such care in a long time. Near midday, the ball of cattle carried from the pasture. The wind now held the grit and dry hiss of a thirsty season. James looked west and said simply, "They're running. Dust storm's coming fast." Without waiting for her reply, he swung into the saddle and gave a tilt of his head. Clara wasn't the kind to stand by. She tied on a kerchief, pulled her hat low, and mounted the old but steady horse her father had once ridden. Together, they drove the herd toward the corrals, the crack of a whip through the wind mixing with the pounding of hooves on hard ground. By the time the first red wave rolled in, James had pushed the last straggler inside. The gate slammed shut just as the wind roared to life. A wall of red dust swallowed the far line of trees. James lashed a wet canvas across the barn door to keep the grit out. They stood in the dim, yellowed light, sweat cutting dark tracks through the dust on their faces. Clara noticed something strange. She had never worked beside someone who neither asked questions, nor boasted, nor rushed the job. James simply did the work, and did it well. When the wind eased, Clara stepped into the house. Her father's oak bookcase still stood in the parlor, wearing a film of dust. Since his death, she had barely touched it, partly for lack of time, partly for fear of the memories it held. But with the smell of dust still clinging from outside, she felt compelled to set things in order. With a damp cloth, she traced the spines of the books. Her fingers paused on a dark brown leather Bible, its edges worn. Her father had once set it on the table every Sunday morning, but no one had opened it in a long while. When she turned a page, something thin slipped free. A folded note. Its edges yellowed. The handwriting was a woman's, elegant and soft, signed Margaret. Beneath the name was a single line. "Wait until the time comes," Clara stared at the words. She had never heard her father mention anyone named Margaret. In her memory, there had only been one wife, her mother, gone for many years now. A chill traced her spine, not from fear, but from touching a secret no one had meant for her to find. The sound of boots on the porch pulled her back. James was passing by with a coil of wire still in hand. She folded the note quickly, but his eyes had already caught the movement. "What's that?" His tone wasn't prying, but it carried enough weight to tell her he'd noticed. "Just an old scrap of paper," she said, slipping it back between the pages. James stepped closer, afternoon light cutting across half his face. "Margaret mean anything to you?" She shook her head. "No, and I don't think my father ever knew anyone by that name." They stood a moment in silence. Clara disliked realizing she was weighing whether she could trust him. Yet in a single day, James had shown he wasn't the kind of man who wasted words. That evening, when the wind had stilled entirely, Clara took the note out onto the porch and sat under the oil lamp. She read the words again and again, searching for something hidden beneath them. Wait until the time comes. What time? Who was meant to wait? A sudden gust snuffed the lamp and carried the paper from her hand. She rose at once, but James stepped out of the shadows before she could move, the note held in his fingers. "Don't lose it," he said quietly, pressing it into her hand. "Might be a clue. For both of us." She looked at him, meaning to ask what both meant, but he had already turned back into the dark, his footsteps fading. One thing was certain. From that moment on, James Calder was no longer just a stranger. He was the man her father had, somehow, chosen to send, and this note might be the thread that bound them both to a truth long buried. That night, a heavy quilt of gray clouds covered the Wyoming sky, blotting out moon and stars. The air felt compressed, so still that Clara could hear the wind slip through the cracks in the doorframe, the porch boards creaking like the bones of an old house. Her sleep was shallow. In dreams, she was a child again, her father still alive. He stood beneath the birch trees in front of the house, his face swallowed in shadow. He didn't look at her, only bent down and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The life beneath the ground. You must hold on to it." Clara jolted awake, sweat beading her forehead. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the kitchen fire down the hall. She had barely caught her breath when she heard something outside. The taut pull of rope, the scrape of wood as if pried loose. She threw on a thin wool sweater, and stepped out onto the porch. In the dim yard, a shadow moved past the north fence. From the barn came the quickened breaths of nervous livestock, mixed with the sharp chop of rope being cut. "There's someone out there," Clara whispered. A low voice behind her answered, making her start. "I hear it too." James stood in the barn doorway, revolver in hand. He signaled for silence, then moved toward the fence, Clara close behind. They moved in a thin wash of light, enough to see each other's outline but not the face of the intruder. As they drew near, the shadow vaulted the fence and vanished into the dark. James swung a leg over to follow, but Clara's voice stopped him. "That's Kane's boundary. You cross it, it's a different game." James halted. Out here, a property line wasn't just ink on a map. It was an unwritten law. Crossing without leave, even in pursuit of a thief, could spark a blood feud. The intruder melted into the direction of Kane's distant stables, leaving behind a ragged cut in the fence and several cattle scattered loose. James and Clara tracked the trail only to lose it in a thicket where her land met Kane's. They returned without a word. James lashed the fence with temporary rope, while Clara calmed the livestock. In both their minds, the thought was the same. There was no need to guess who had sent the man. By morning, the sky had cleared, but the air carried no relief. Clara was feeding the hens when a man in a brown coat rode into the yard, an envelope in hand. She didn't need to open it to know. "Notice from the bank," he said flatly, neither cold nor warm. "You've got until the end of the month to settle the remaining debt, or start packing." Clara's eyes locked on the bold type. Final deadline. The numbers beneath hammered into her mind. Even selling off every head of cattle and pawning what she could, the sum would fall short. The messenger rode away, leaving a wide emptiness in the yard. James stepped over, glanced at the paper, but didn't ask. Instead, he set a saddle down on the porch rail. "There's something I haven't told you," he began slowly. "I once had a ranch, not a small one, in Montana. Good soil, water enough to last. I thought I was smart enough to keep it. I was wrong." Clara looked up. James kept his eyes on the leather gloves in his hands, turning them as if shaping the words. "My former boss, the man I worked for before I bought the place, he lent me money at what I thought was a fair rate. Then the drought hit. Lost the crops. I couldn't make the payments. He used the papers I'd signed without reading close and—" James paused, just long enough for the silence to sharpen. "I lost it all. The land, the herd. All I had left was the horse under me and what I could tie to the saddle." Clara's grip on the bank notice tightened. "You're telling me this to say I'll lose everything too?" James met her eyes. "I'm telling you I know what it feels like, and I'm not about to watch it happen again, if you'll let me help." She wanted to push back, to keep the distance between them. But the image of last night's shadow slipping toward Kane's land, and her father's words in the dream, closed her throat on the reply. That afternoon, Clara went to draw water from the well. The late sun slanted down, turning the surface into a dark bronze mirror. She heard her father's voice again. The life beneath the ground. Was he speaking of this water source, or something deeper, something both Kane and the bank would gladly take? Night settled. The ranch fell into quiet. James slept in the barn, Clara in her small room. But between them, an invisible cord had begun to take shape, not woven from spoken trust, but from moments spent standing in the dark together, hearing the same sound, and knowing neither of them was alone. That morning, Clara set herself to clearing the far corner of the storage shed, where her father's things had been left untouched since the day he died. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood, dry straw, and a faint trace of tobacco that had long since gone cold, yet lingered as if someone had been standing there only last night. At the bottom of a stack of wooden crates, she found a small oak chest. The brass lock was still intact, tarnished but solid. On the lid was a simple carving, a teardrop framed by curling lines like waves. Clara's fingers traced the grooves, her heart quickening. She carried the chest inside and set it on the kitchen table. Sunlight angled through the window, casting the carved lines into sharp relief, as if the design had come alive. She tried the lock, but of course it didn't give. James came in from the yard, dust on his hands. He took one look at the chest, and for a moment, his expression shifted, like a man who'd seen something similar before, somewhere long ago. "Your father's?" he asked. "Yes, but I've never seen it until now," Clara replied, her voice just taut enough to betray her unease. James bent over, his fingers brushing the lock, then pausing on something Clara hadn't expected, the silver hairpin she often wore, lying on the table beside it. "This. Let me try something." Before she could protest, he took the pin and worked its point into the keyhole. A soft click sounded, light as a breath, but enough to send a shiver down Clara's spine. The lid lifted. Inside, lined with faded gray velvet, was a smaller wooden box with a sliding lid and a twine-bound envelope. Clara opened the envelope first. The paper held lines of handwriting, but they weren't sentences. Numbers and letters were interwoven, some kind of code. Beneath it, in her father's familiar hand, was a single line. "Use the Bible I always read." She and James exchanged a look. "Which passage did he read the most?" James asked. Clara remembered winter evenings by the fire, his low voice reading from the old Bible, about a river flowing through dry country, where water meant life. James suggested bringing the Bible out. They set the paper beside it, matching each number to a verse, each letter to a word. By the time the sunlight slanted toward the west, fragments of a message had emerged. The land and the water rights are hidden. The chill that went through Clara was sharp and cold. Water rights. In this country, they were worth more than gold. A hidden spring or the legal right to draw from the nearest river could turn barren ground into a thriving spread, or a failing ranch into a living fortune. She stepped back and let James work through the rest. But the message blurred, incomplete, the missing words breaking the trail. "Looks like part of the cipher's missing," James said. "If your father meant to hide it, he might have split it into pieces." Clara's gaze went to the window, to the red ridgeline cutting across the horizon. And in that moment, the puzzle began to align. Kane's pressure to sell, the nighttime fence cutters, the dream about the life beneath the ground, all of it pointed to one thing: water. Her fist closed around the paper. Kane doesn't just want the land. He wants the water. If he gets it, he controls the whole valley. James leaned against the table, eyes steady. "If that's true, we need proof, enough to stand up in territorial court. Kane can't keep this buried forever." Clara nodded, slowly. For the first time since James had shown up, she was truly considering trust, not because he'd defended her or put in the work, but because he spoke of territorial law like a man who understood it, and meant to use it against those who thought themselves above it. As Clara packed the smaller box and the Bible back into the chest, she understood. This was no longer a matter of one small ranch standing against a land baron. This was a fight for survival, and it might be her last in Wyoming. James closed the lid, slid the hairpin back into the lock. Tomorrow, we start looking for the rest of the cipher. But we move careful. If Kane gets wind of what we've found, he won't stay quiet. Clara managed a faint smile, though there was no lightness in it. She knew from here on, every step they took could be watched. That morning, Clara decided she needed to ride into town for supplies. The road from the ranch to the center was little more than 10 miles, but lately, each trip carried a weight it never had before. The air seemed thicker in the drifting dust, and the folks she used to greet along the way now avoided her eyes. James offered to go with her, but Clara refused. She still had her pride. She didn't want anyone thinking she needed a man at her side for protection. He only said one thing, his tone even, but edged with warning. Go early, come back early, and don't believe everything you hear. Main Street was already stirring when Clara tied her horse outside the general store. Sunlight slanted under the wooden awnings onto the red dirt road, glinting off dusty glass windows. Inside, the air was rich with pine wood, roasted coffee, and the clean bite of soap. She had just dropped a few bags of sugar and flour into her basket when a gravelly voice came from behind her. You're Elias Wynn's girl, aren't you? Clara turned to see a thin, stooped old man, his beard silvered and stained yellow from tobacco. His eyes narrowed as if making certain his memory was right. Yes, I'm Clara, she answered slowly. He gave a small nod, the corner of his mouth lifting like a man who'd just found a missing piece of a puzzle. Name's Amos Grant. I worked with your father once, back in the west shaft of the mine. Been many years since I last saw Elias. Before she could reply, Amos went on, his voice dropping. There was a cave-in once. Rock and dirt blocked the way out. Everyone was panicking, but Kane, Victor Kane, went in after him, pulled Elias clear before the whole ceiling came down. If not for Kane, your father wouldn't have made it. Clara froze. The story cut across the picture she held of Kane, a man who bled others dry, forcing them into corners. Amos sighed. From then on, Elias and Kane, well, they were friends of a sort. Not the drinking together every night kind, but enough to trust each other when it mattered. He paused, glancing toward the shelves. I hear Kane's been wanting your land. Maybe he thinks Elias would have agreed if he were still around. Clara's grip on the basket tightened, her hand trembling slightly. Her father, the man she'd always believed saw through Kane, had owed him his life? And if so, was all this just Kane calling in that debt, whatever the cost? On the way home, Clara stopped at the blacksmith's for a hinge she'd ordered last week. But the smith, who had once bought milk from her, wouldn't meet her eyes. Sorry, your order's not ready, he said, voice stiff. As she stepped out, she caught sight of a large man in a leather coat standing at the street corner, arms folded. He didn't move, only watched her with a cold, measuring gaze. At the produce stand, the shopkeeper, who usually greeted her with a smile, set down a bundle of celery without a word. A customer nearby murmured something. The woman nodded, and Clara knew she'd just walked through a fresh ripple of rumor. She didn't need James to tell her what was happening. Kane was tightening the circle. Not with muscle or the law, but with fear. He didn't have to speak a word. All he had to do was let people believe that siding with Clara meant standing against him. When Clara returned, James was in the barn with Blackthorn's reins in hand. One look at her face told him enough. "What did someone say to you?" His voice was even, but his eyes had sharpened. She told him about Amos Grant, about the mine cave-in, and the shifting glances of the townsfolk. She ended with the question she didn't want the answer to. If my father owed Cain his life, am I fighting against a man who once saved our family? James stepped closer, removing his gloves and slipping them into his pocket before he spoke. I once lost everything because I believed a past debt would keep a man on my side. But an old favor doesn't erase what's wrong now. Good men can do bad things, and when they do, they're still responsible for them. Clara was silent. His words drove in like a nail into a loose board in her mind. Remember, James went on, Cain doesn't just want your land. He wants what's under it. And he won't stop for the sake of a 20-year-old memory. In the days that followed, the town's distance grew sharper. A cattleman canceled his order for hay, claiming he didn't need it this season, though he wouldn't meet her eyes when he said it. The postman delivered her mail late, as if to make sure news reached her slower. A group of women who once bought her eggs now said they'd found a cheaper, cleaner source. Clara realized Cain didn't need to appear. He only had to plant enough whispers and let them spread like weeds on dry ground. She began to feel the isolation, not just on the ranch, but in her own thoughts, as if the world were slowly shrinking in around her. James, meanwhile, seemed untouched by it. He kept mending fence, tending the horses, and riding into town when needed, always returning with the same steady calm. But Clara knew there was calculation behind his eyes. He'd begun collecting the threads of gossip, weaving them together to find Cain's weak point. One evening, as sunset stretched long shadows over the red dust, James came to where Clara was stacking flour sacks in the storeroom. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start at the North Well. If your father's story about the water source is true, that's the first place Cain will want control, and I want to see it for myself." Clara nodded. She no longer felt certain she understood the whole picture, but one thing was clear. If they didn't find proof, the rumors alone would bury this ranch before Cain ever had to make a move. Outside, the wind moved across the fields, lifting red dust into thin, shifting veils, and in that moment, Clara had the strange sense that Wyoming itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would yield first, her or Victor Cain. By midday, Clara returned from the vegetable patch with a basket of freshly pulled carrots, only to sense something was wrong. The barn door stood wide open, its hinges groaning with each push of the wind. The rope that tied it shut was nowhere in sight. Blackthorn, James's horse, was still there, but restless, tossing its head, mane bristled. The others shifted in their stalls, breathing fast, hooves scraping the dirt, as if someone had just disturbed them. Clara set the basket down and hurried forward, heart thudding. Inside, a corner of hay had been trampled into a flattened trail leading out. She called out, sharp, "James!" His footsteps came from the granary. One look, and James understood. He said nothing at first, only crouched to examine the ground. "Boot tracks," he murmured. "Not mine, not yours." Clara leaned down beside him. Sure enough, on the damp earth lay the distinct prints of narrow-toed high boots, the worn soles uneven. The tracks led toward the edge of the field before turning north. "Where to?" she asked. James's hand tightened on the strap of the revolver at his hip. The creek. The northern creek wasn't large, but it fed the underground flow that kept the ranch alive. When they reached it, the sight stopped Clara cold. A line of burlap sacks wedged across the current, damming the water into a stagnant, murky pool. Old planks had been nailed in place at the choke point, keeping the flow from spilling onto Winland. Someone, Clara's fists curled tight, is trying to cut off our water. James didn't answer right away. He stepped to the bank, crouched, and studied the work. His eyes narrowed before he looked back at her. This was done clean, quick, and with intent, not the work of petty vandals. She frowned. You know more than you're saying, don't you? Their eyes locked. A silence stretched longer than necessary. Finally, he said, I know this kind of job. Whoever did this isn't just after the water. They want to wear you down. And when you break, they'll take the land and your name with it. A wave of anger and unease rose in her. And when were you planning to tell me? After everything's gone. James's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. When I was certain, telling you too soon without proof would only give you more to carry. She turned away, forcing down the sharp edge of her frustration. The past days, Kane's pressure, the rumors, the cold shoulders, had worn her patience thin. By late afternoon, the light dimmed faster than usual. Heavy clouds rolled in from the west, their edges inked in purple-black like spilled dye across the sky. James and Clara barred the barn doors, secured the feed sacks, and stacked more wood by the hearth. The smell of rain mixed with the faint tang of burning pine in the house. When night settled, they sat by the fire, the gold and amber light deepening the tired lines in both their faces. The pop and crackle of logs was joined by the first high whistle of wind against the walls. James spoke slowly, as if voicing something that had been settled in his mind for some time. I once worked for a man in Montana, not so different from Kane, greedy, wanted everything in his grasp. When he bought land, he bought the water, the roads in, and if he could, the very breath of the people who lived there. Clara tilted her head, silent, listening. I saw him drive a family off their ranch. They had nothing left but a few starved cattle. I kept watch while he took their land. Back then I told myself I was just doing the job I was paid for. But I knew I was helping tear apart a life. I walked away, but... He stopped, his gaze fixed on the fire. I never walked away from what I saw. In his voice was something heavier than regret, a wound that hadn't healed, only been covered in silence. From the moment I got here, he said, I knew Kane would do the same, and I'm not about to let it happen again. Clara understood then. James wasn't just a hired hand or a protector. He was a man who'd once stood on the wrong side of justice and carried the weight of it. That gave him a sharper insight into Kane's mind and a reason to stand with her that went deeper than duty. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the damp earth smell and the cold breath of the storm. Thunder rolled in the distance, echoing off the hills. James stood to check the windows, then stepped out to the barn once more. This storm will wipe the tracks, he said when he turned. If anyone's still nearby, tonight's their chance to cover what they've done. Clara watched the flames, turning his words over. In both the literal and the figurative sense, the storm was here, a storm of weather and of men. If they didn't move quickly, by the time the skies cleared, there might be nothing left to save. She rose, added wood to the fire, and looked at James. Tomorrow, we start at the creek. I want to see it myself, and I'm not letting anything stay hidden this time." James nodded, and in that brief moment, no other words were needed. Outside, the wind howled harder, but in the small house, an unspoken accord was taking shape. A readiness for the confrontation they both knew was inevitable. The morning after the storm, the red earth around the ranch was soaked, scattered with small puddles that mirrored patches of silver-gray sky. As James had predicted, the tracks from the night before were gone, washed clean. The damp, earthy smell of crushed grass mixed with the scent of wet pine drifting from the distant woods. Clara was herding the chickens back into their coop when the sound of hoofbeats carried down the dirt road. Through the haze of early mist, a rider appeared, Thomas Reed, the neighbor who lived about 2.5 miles away. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s, hair threaded with silver, his seat in the saddle steady as if nailed there. "Morning, Miss Wynne," Thomas called warmly as he reined up by the fence. "Storm last night must have soaked this place through." Clara smiled, setting her basket down. "We're fine. Thank you for checking in." Thomas let his gaze sweep the yard, quick, but with a certain weighing to it. "Heard something in town. Figured you ought to know." Clara stepped closer, tilting her head. "What is it?" "Word is Kane's planning to send the marshal out here. Not sure exactly why, but I'd guess to poke around the property or the papers. Thought you'd be better off ready." James emerged from the barn in time to catch the last part. He stayed a few paces back, his eyes fixed on Thomas, measuring the weight of every word. "Who'd you hear that from?" Thomas gave a slight shrug. "The saloons where news runs fastest. But this one's not just bar talk. I know Kane's got friends in the marshal's office." Clara felt her chest tighten. The past months had already worn her thin. Now came the threat of a federal visit, conveniently timed to Kane's liking. Still, she kept her voice even. "Thank you, Thomas. We'll be ready." James's gaze stayed wary, but Clara saw no reason to turn away a man bringing a warning. She unlatched the gate. "Come in for some coffee? It's still cold out." That evening, Clara decided to invite Thomas to stay for supper, partly out of gratitude, partly because she caught a loneliness in his eyes, the kind frontier folk recognized in one another. It had been a long time since Clara had shared a meal without tension knotting the air. Now and then she noticed James casting sidelong glances at Thomas, still guarded but less sharp than before. Perhaps even James could see that while Thomas might not be perfect, he was one of the few who hadn't turned his back on them. After supper, Thomas pulled on his hat and made ready to leave. At the doorway, he paused, as if considering another word, but only smiled instead. "If the marshal does head this way, I'll bring word. Make sure you bolt the doors tonight." When the sound of his horse faded into the dark, Clara stood at the window, watching his shape dissolve into shadow. James stepped up beside her, arms folded. "You trust him?" His tone held no accusation, only the need to know. Clara nodded slightly. "I trust kindness when it shows itself, James. Out here, it's no small thing for someone to bring news to your door." James was quiet for a long moment, then said only, "I hope you're right." That morning, the first light had barely slipped over the ridgelines when Clara rose, pulled on her coat, and stepped into the yard. James was already at the barn, checking the fences after the storm. The air was still heavy with damp, the scent of rain-soaked earth clinging to every step. She was about to fetch a pail of water when voices carried from the barn. Thomas's deep, quick cadence, and another voice, rougher, that Clara knew at once. Bill Crowley, one of Kane's hired hands, the same man she'd seen at the saloon, his gaze always fixed on someone's purse. "Marshall's coming sooner than planned. I'll do my part, as long as Kane keeps his word," Thomas said, voice low but threading clearly through the cracks in the planks. Bill gave a dry laugh. "Kane keep his word to anyone? Just finish the job and get out. Don't think you're the exception." Clara felt her stomach drop, the blood draining from her face. Every bit of trust she'd given Thomas, every warm moment over supper, shattered like pottery under a boot heel. She started toward the barn door, hands tightening, but a firm grip closed over her wrist. James. He shook his head, his eyes stern but not angry. "Not now," he whispered. "If we show our hand, Kane changes his play, and we lose every chance." Clara bit her lip but let go. James led her around to the back of the barn, where they could watch unseen. Thomas was passing an envelope to Bill. Bill opened it, smirked, and swung into the saddle before galloping off. Thomas stood there alone, looking after him, not relieved, but like a man who'd just signed his own sentence. That afternoon, James spoke less than usual. He checked his saddle, sharpened his knife, his movements those of a man bracing for something no one wanted. Clara knew he meant to follow Thomas, but that would mean stepping into danger. By nightfall, lanterns glowed across the valley. James told Clara to stay inside. "If I'm not back by midnight, lock the doors and wait for morning." But Clara had never been one to sit idle. An hour later, she pulled on her coat and slipped out, keeping to the creek bank that led toward Kane's property. The deeper she went, the louder the sounds of crickets and running water grew. Near the edge of the woods, she heard shouting. Firelight flickered from a small camp, casting the scene into stark relief. Thomas on his knees, flanked by two men. One of them was Bill. "Kane doesn't want trouble," Bill said, his hand resting on his gun. "You've done your part. Now it's time to disappear." Thomas's breath came hard. "I kept my word. The marshal, he's on his way here. Why would you—" The second man cut him off with a hard kick to the chest, knocking him flat. Bill drew his gun. Clara froze, her throat tight. Before she could think, James burst from the shadows, fast and clean. A shot cracked, splintering bark from a nearby tree. James took the second man down, wrestled the gun free and turned on Bill, knocking him to the ground until he lay still. Thomas clutched his ribs, breathing ragged. James hauled him up. "If you want to live, walk away, now." They didn't stop until the warm glow of Clara's windows came into sight. Clara rushed forward, relief flooding her even as her hands still shook. In the kitchen, Thomas slumped into a chair, cold sweat on his forehead. "I thought I could control it. Kane swore he'd only use me for information. I was a fool to believe him." Clara folded her arms, her voice steady. "You betrayed us." Thomas lowered his head. "I know, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I owe my life to James, and to you tonight." James stood at the window, watching the dark beyond. "If you mean that, then help us turn this around. Kane's setting up a false marshal to make the land grab look legal. We need proof before he moves." Thomas lifted his head, something different in his eyes now, no longer the clouded look of a man trying to walk two sides. "I know where Kane keeps his papers, in the storage shed behind the saloon. Only his men go in and out." Clara's hand tightened around the silver hairpin in her hair. the same one that had opened her father's oak chest. Then we'll take them, not just for the land, but to know exactly who my father put his faith in. The plan took shape that very night. Thomas would guide them into town, James would handle the entry and escape, and Clara would identify the documents tied to the water rights. Outside, the night wind began to rise again, carrying the dry grit that heralded another storm. Time was running short, and this time, none of them could be certain they'd come back whole. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his weathered hands moving slowly over the time-worn wood. The lamplight caught on the deep scratches and scars in his fingers, marks from a lifetime of work under an open sky. Picking up a piece of charcoal, he began sketching a rough diagram directly on the tabletop, each stroke deliberate, as if weighing every mark before it was made. "Cain doesn't keep his records at his house," he began, his voice low and steady. "He uses an attic room behind the Red Horse Saloon. Not many folks go there, and most of his important papers are stored in that space. If we're going to find the original survey map and the water rights, that's the one place to look." James stood with his arms folded, his eyes never leaving the drawing. "The front door?" "Double lock," Thomas answered. "One key with Bill, Cain's foreman, and the other with Cain himself. But there's a way up through the livery stable and back. Narrow wooden stairs. Only a handful of people know about it, and Cain keeps it that way." Clara leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. She'd seen enough in the past weeks to know Cain never played his hand in the open. Everything happened behind a curtain, or in the dark. "If we get those papers, he won't be able to lie in front of the territorial court." James nodded, the decision already written in his eyes. "Wait too long and he'll move them. We go tonight." A crescent moon hung low, its thin light laying pale strips across the damp dirt road after the evening rain. They left the horses in an alley a few blocks from the saloon, far enough not to draw attention. Thomas led them across the darkened yard behind the Red Horse. The stable was quiet, save for the soft snort of a horse in the shadows. When the heavy wooden door gave a low groan, the smell of hay and manure mixed with the lingering tang of old whiskey drifting down from the saloon above. "In the corner," Thomas whispered, pointing toward a shadowed spot where the steep stairs rose. James went first, testing each step with his hand before trusting his weight to it. When he signaled, Clara followed, her heartbeat quickening, not just from the risk, but from the sense that they were stepping closer to something her father had never told her. The attic was just tall enough to stand with a stoop. A single oil lamp on a side table threw a pale circle of light over rows of battered wooden cabinets. Boxes and bundles of paper were stacked high, the air thick with the smell of damp paper, rusted metal, and dust that had been settling for years. James opened the first cabinet, pulling out a bundle of oilcloth-wrapped maps. Black ink lines marked property boundaries, but Thomas flipped past them until his fingers settled on one sheet, yellowed with age, its edges gnawed by mice. "This is the original," he murmured. Cain redrew it, shifted the boundaries to take part of Elias Wynn's land, your father's land. Clara bent over it, her eyes fixed on the red territorial seal stamped in the corner. It certified both land ownership and the water rights, rights worth more than gold in this country. If this sees daylight, he's got nothing to stand on. James nodded, but kept searching. His hand closed around a file bound in cracked leather, its cover labeled, "Water Rights, Little Mesa River." He handed it to Clara. She opened it, and her breath caught. The previous owner field read, Margaret Wynne, lawful wife of Elias Wynne. Margaret. The name slipped from her lips. It had never once appeared in any story her father had told. In her mind, her father and mother had always been the beginning of everything. The land, the creek, the memories of childhood. Thomas hesitated. Margaret was Elias's first wife. She disappeared before he married your mother. Some say she held part of the water rights, and her family had disputes with Cain's people. A chill traced Clara's spine. The pieces, Cain, her father, the water, were beginning to link in ways she hadn't wanted to imagine. Heavy footsteps in the stable below froze them all. James pinched out the oil lamp and gestured for them to crouch. Through a thin gap between the wallboards, flickering lamplight moved below, and Cain's voice rolled up. Deep, unmistakable. Tear the place apart, he ordered. I know someone's been sniffing around these papers. The scrape of cabinets, the thud of crates shifting. Sweat trickled down Clara's temple. James stuffed the map and the file into a cloth satchel and pressed it into her hands. His voice was a low, hard whisper. Hold on to this. If I get caught, burn it. They slid down the back stairs, aiming for the side door. But as they hit the ground, a shout cracked through the dark, sharp as a knife. Cain stood blocking the stable exit, gun in hand, his eyes burning. Tonight, he snarled, I finish this before the sun comes up. James didn't hesitate. He yanked Clara toward the shadowed alley. Thomas was right behind them. The gunshot boomed, the bullet splintering a crate inches from Clara's arm, showering her with wood dust. They didn't stop until they cleared the edge of town, where their horses waited. In one motion, they swung into the saddles, spurring into a hard gallop. The pounding of hooves matched the wind screaming in their ears, and Clara's heartbeat found the same relentless rhythm. When the ranch came into sight, she was still clutching the satchel tight to her chest. Inside lay the original map, the water rights, and the name of Margaret Wynne. But more than that, she knew Cain now understood exactly what they had taken. Far in the east, a thin gray seam of dawn began to open against the dark sky. But this dawn carried no peace. It came trailing Cain's promise, cold and certain, that he would end it all before the light reached this land. The Wyoming sky that morning was a whetstone gray. The sun swallowed whole behind a heavy lid of clouds. Wind came rolling down from the north, carrying the tang of dust and rust, like the breath before a hard storm. Clara Wynne stood on the front porch, eyes fixed on the road to town. She knew Cain wouldn't let things drag on any longer. Then came the drum of hoofbeats, shattering the stillness. 4 riders, their mounts sleek and well-fed, approached at an unhurried but deliberate pace. At the head rode a man in a long brown coat, a gleaming badge pinned to his chest. A marshal, or at least, he looked the part. Behind him sat Victor Cain, upright in the saddle as if this road already belonged to him. The fake marshal read an order of seizure, his voice ringing out like a hammer striking a headstone. But before he could spur his horse forward, another voice cut in from down the road. That's enough! From the south came another group of riders, led by Judge Harlan Whitmore, senior magistrate of the territory. He didn't rush, but each measured step of his horse made Cain's jaw tighten. Whitmore was not a man easily bought. The judge stopped, studying Cain the way one might size up a wounded animal. Then he turned to Clara, his old but clear eyes locking onto hers. You're Clara Wynne? he asked, not to confirm, but to recall. When she nodded, a faint smile touched his lips. Your father pulled me out of the mine collapse back in '68. I owe him my life. His voice lowered, turning toward the fake marshal. By territorial law, no seizure can be enforced without proper review and evidence. I'm granting a 24-hour stay to examine this case. The words punched a hole clean through Kane's plans. He swallowed his anger, but his eyes carried a promise of reprisal. 24 hours. He would waste none of them. When Kane's party withdrew, James Calder stepped up beside Clara. We just bought time, but 24 hours. Either we've got the proof by then, or it's all gone. Clara drew a deep breath, the cold cutting through her coat. Then we use every minute. That afternoon, James rode out to neighboring ranches, calling in favors. They didn't just need witnesses. They needed watchful eyes in case Kane turned to violence before court. Clara stayed back, handling provisions. In the kitchen, warm with the scent of burning pine, she and Thomas Reed packed dry goods, cartridges, and water. Every sack was tied tight with twine, ready for a long night. By sundown, the shadows had stretched thin over the valley. Out front, James and two men from the McAllister place built a lookout platform, picking high ground with a clear view of the approach road. Below, a few younger hands practiced loading rifles, their movements awkward but their eyes steady with resolve. Clara brought each man a tin cup of black coffee. No one spoke of fear, but it was there, quiet as the wind hissing through the eaves. Thomas leaned toward James, low enough that Clara couldn't hear. If Kane makes a move tonight, can we hold them? James glanced at Clara before answering. We'll hold. There's no second option. Night fell hard. The main house's oil lamps threw the only warm light for miles, a single gold mark in a sea of cold black. Clara sat at the table, spreading out the papers and maps they'd taken from Kane's storehouse. James pointed to a teardrop-shaped symbol near the boundary line. That's the water rights. If we prove Kane hid this, he loses everything tied to it. Clara flipped through the file, her fingers stopping on a name. Margaret Wynne. My father's first wife. He never spoke of her. Her voice trembled, not from fear of Kane, but from the weight of a family truth surfacing too late. James rested a hand on the table's edge, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the steadiness in him. Near midnight, the wind rose, battering the walls as if trying to shoulder through. From the lookout came a long, sharp whistle. James snatched up his rifle and bolted outside. On the eastern trail, 3 riders moved in fast. Not locals, one of the watchers muttered. James raised a hand, signaling silence, letting the figures draw closer. At 200 paces, the glow of lanterns caught their faces. It was Kane's men, scouting the place, probing for a gap. From the porch, Clara watched, her pulse hammering. James turned back, shaking his head. Just reconnaissance. They're not ready to push it. But both of them knew the night was still young. Inside again, Clara stood by the hearth, watching the flames chew slowly through a thick log. Tomorrow changes everything. James paused in the doorway, the lamplight cutting hard lines into his face. Tomorrow, we finish this, on the terms your father deserved. By dawn, the frost clung silver to every blade of grass. Every man and woman who'd come to help was in position. Riflemen hidden in the old barn, on the loft above the shed, behind haystacks lining the yard. The road in stood bare, but every approach was under watch. Clara stepped onto the porch, her hair tied back, her eyes clear and fixed. In her coat pocket, the folded note from Margaret pressed against her hand, a reminder that this fight was for more than land or water. It was for the truth long buried. James came to stand beside her, handing her a freshly oiled revolver. "If they come early, don't hesitate." She met his gaze squarely. "We won't let them win." In the distance, a plume of dust began to rise from the road to town. The 24-hour deadline was closing in, and with it, the moment that would decide everything. As the horizon bled from black to gray, the small campfires along the ridge blinked out, one after the other. No bugle call was needed. Every soul knew it was time. Annie handed her child to the widow beside her, as carefully as one might pass a jug of the last clean water before climbing to the watchtower. Luke checked the sight on his Sharps rifle as if he were checking his own eyes. The preacher opened his Bible to the passage about the river in the desert. On the slope, figures began to move. Not in neat rows like the morning before, but in a tightening ring. Each man spaced just far enough not to lose sight of the other, just close enough not to lose courage. James gripped the rope of the warning bell. "3 long rings when I say," he told the men around him, his voice low, speaking almost to the wind. Clara stood beside him, eyes fixed on the road to town, the same road Judge Whitmore's black carriage had rolled down the day before, watching it like a child waiting for a father to return. The sky was brightening, but the truth was still half a day away. On the far ridge, Victor Kane urged his horse a step forward, his hat gleaming like a slab of black stone. He didn't lift any papers. He just lifted his hand, the hand of a man used to giving orders without wasting words. The men behind him understood. The circle tightened another notch. James pulled the rope. Boom, boom, boom. The sound rang heavy and round through the air, breaking apart like the first raindrops striking cracked earth. From the east, 2 riders broke off the trail, galloping hard, news moving faster than the wind. The 24 hours weren't over, but their hour, the one they'd been fighting for, had begun. That morning's dawn didn't carry the soft gold of a peaceful day. Instead, the sky was the color of cold steel, heavy clouds pressed low. The light choked into stillness until it felt like the air itself had stopped breathing. Wind came down from the north, sharp with dust and the faint, bitter scent of horsehide. On the trail leading into the Wynn Ranch, a massive plume of dust rose, warning that Kane's men were coming. He rode a coal-black stallion, his back ramrod straight, coattails snapping with every pounding stride. Behind him trailed nearly 30 hired guns, hats pulled low, eyes hard and cold as river stones. On the porch, Clara gripped the revolver James had handed her the night before. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the absolute clarity that this moment would decide everything. James stood beside her, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the fence line and the places they had set for cover. From the south, the allies James had summoned began to arrive, riding in like shadows, joining the line. They came from ranches all across the territory, folks who'd had enough of Kane's land grabs and water theft. When Kane and his men were within 50 paces of the fence, he raised a hand to halt them. The wind caught the brim of one gunman's hat, snapping it back to reveal a face weathered and cracked by years of sun and war. "End this now, Wynn!" Kane roared, his voice grinding like iron on stone. "Give up the land and the water rights, or we'll take them our way. James's reply was steady, his voice carrying far. You've had your 24 hours. Now it'll be the law that decides, not your gun. Kane's laugh was sharp, his eyes cutting like a blade. The law? I brought the law with me. He gestured, and in the same breath, his men lifted their rifles. The first shot cracked from Kane's side. The bullet smashed into the porch post beside Clara, splinters exploding into the air. In an instant, both sides erupted. Bullets hissed through the cold morning, brass casings clattering onto hard-packed earth. Clara crouched behind the water barrel, aiming and firing. Each pull of the trigger pounded in her ears, her heart somehow louder than the gunfire. James held the high ground, every shot deliberate, forcing Kane's line to keep their heads down. On the left flank, Thomas Reed crawled from behind a dirt berm, Winchester in hand. He took his time, lined up his sights, and fired, dropping one of Kane's sharpshooters, the same man who had cost many a rancher their land. The gun flew from the man's grip as he hit the dirt. Minutes dragged like whole winters. The smell of gunpowder, sweat, and hot metal pressed thick in every breath. Horses screamed, some bolting in panic. Clara reloaded, scanning for James. He was still there, but the shoulder of his coat had been torn by a grazing shot. He caught her eye and gave a quick nod, enough to tell her he was fine. Then, from the distance, a strange sound cut through the fight, a high, piercing bugle call. The gunfire faltered as heads turned toward the western road. A column of cavalry in deep blue uniforms rode into view, the federal flag snapping high above them. At their head was a man wearing a real badge, Marshal Everett Cole. He rode straight into the open ground between the two forces, holding aloft a paper sealed in red wax. Cease fire. By order of the United States, this is an unlawful seizure. No one dared shoot with the shadow of the federal flag over the field. Kane's grip on his reins tightened, eyes darting for escape, but the cavalry was already circling from three sides. Marshal Cole's gaze locked on the so-called marshal at Kane's side. Fake badge, forged order, and fraud against the United States government. With a swift motion, he tore the badge from the man's chest and tossed it to the dirt. Then he turned to Kane. Victor Kane, you're under arrest for issuing a false order of confiscation, armed intimidation, and attempted theft of property. For a heartbeat, the gathered allies of Clara and James were silent. Then the cheer rose like a wave breaking on rock. Folks who had endured Kane's bullying for years now watched as iron cuffs closed around his wrists. Clara stepped from cover, her revolver still in hand, but lowered. The crowd parted to let her and James walk forward. Kane's gaze found hers, still burning with hatred. But with his power broken and soldiers at his back, he was nothing more than a shadow of what he'd been. Thomas passed by, clapping a hand to James's shoulder. It's done. James only nodded, but in his eyes Clara saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. True relief. On the wind porch, the federal flag was planted firm, the wind filling it like a sail. Beneath it, those who had fought for the past 24 hours stood together, silent, watching Kane being led away. No loud celebration was needed. This moment alone was enough to close a long, dangerous chapter. Clara tightened her grip on James's hand, not seeking support, but sharing the unshakable certainty that from this day forward, the land would be kept, not just by paper, but by the people willing to stand for it. The harsh prairie winter retreated slowly, leaving behind swaths of sodden earth from the melting ice. From above, The once parched hills now glistened with winding ribbons of water, flowing under the pale sunlight of early spring. The creek running along the eastern boundary of the Wynn Ranch brimmed full, carrying with it an unending murmur, as if to assert its own freedom, a freedom Clara and James had risked their lives to keep. After the battle under the federal flag, the land and its water rights had been returned to their rightful owner. But the greater change lay in the air between people. Neighbors who once kept to themselves now crossed each other's fields to share news, mend fences, and trade crops. Along the dirt road leading to the newly dug community well, groups lined up with wooden buckets and tin pails. No one pushed ahead. Everyone knew this water belonged to all of them now. It was no longer a weapon Victor Kane could use to choke the life out of others. One morning, Clara stood at the creek's edge, her hand dipped into the cold current. The water slipped between her fingers, reflecting the sky's clear blue. She said nothing, only smiled faintly, as if the stream was telling her another story, one of endurance and the cost of standing one's ground. James came up beside her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "This season will be good," he said, his voice no longer carrying the strain of the past months. "There's enough water to irrigate the south pasture. We'll start sowing next week." Clara nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the current, as if to memorize every ripple, every flicker of light. This was not just life for the land. It was proof of everything they had endured. Word spread quickly. Clara was carrying twins. For many, it was a sure sign that the Wynn Ranch had entered a new era. Women from neighboring homesteads stopped by with herbs, baked bread, and blessings. One day, Mrs. Marie from the next ranch over brought a wooden cradle, the same one that had rocked her 4 children. "Now it's your turn," she said, setting it carefully under the porch eave. Clara thanked her, and when her eyes met James's, she saw that rare smile, the kind unshadowed by worry. Yet even with peace at their doorstep, both Clara and James knew their victory was not the end. Word of Cain's trial traveled fast, but so did whispers that he still had men scattered out there. Strangers had begun appearing at the town saloon, quietly asking about boundary lines, saying the name Wynn with a tone halfway between mockery and calculation. Spring unfolded with longer days, clearer skies, and the sound of children playing in the yards between ranches. Folks gathered in the evenings, building fires, telling stories, and sharing meals. One night, Clara and James stood together at the north fence, looking out over the fields greening again. "Do you think the day will come when we won't have to keep watch?" Clara asked. James was silent for a long while before he answered. "Maybe. But if not, at least we know we won't be alone." Her smile came easily at that. She didn't wish for a life without trouble, only that when trouble came, they would face it together. Out here, holding the land and the water was one thing, but holding firm to one's will, that was what truly decided everything. And as her father used to say, the time would come, and when it did, she and James would stand again, as they had before. As darkness settled, James stepped onto the porch, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. They sat side by side, words unnecessary. Before them lay the land they had kept. Behind them stood the house still strong. And between them lived something no one could take away, the resolve to guard it all, no matter how people or time might change. The oil lamp on the porch flickered, casting gold light across the small flag hanging by the door, a federal flag, now faded some, but still snapping in the wind. Clara looked at it, then at James, and knew that even though the season of new water had come, the fight to protect it would never truly end. If you've stayed until the end of this story, perhaps you've felt it too, that sometimes what keeps us rooted is not only love, but the faith that we are not alone. If Clara and James's story has reached you, leave a like and subscribe to join us for more Wild West journeys, where love and courage ride together. And before you go, I'd like to ask, what do you think truly won the day for Clara and James? Guns, wit, or a promise that never wavered? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll read every single one.